Hey, it's Erin, and I'm here joined by my friend and colleague, pelvic floor physical therapist, Lindsay Geddes. Welcome, Lindsay. Thanks for coming.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk about something that many of you ask me all the time, and it has to do with the pelvic floor and constipation or sluggish motility. So sometimes it's in our guts, sometimes it's in our habits, but sometimes it's actually the pelvic floor that is part of the problem. So I'm so thankful to have Lindsay here to help explain how these are really interrelated. So for someone who's struggling with constipation or sluggish motility, is there a way to tell if the pelvic floor is part of the problem?
Love this question. And it may be an unpopular answer, but the big answer is that it's always part of the problem. It just depends on how much of the problem it is. So if your constipation was a pie, it's the kind of pie that you don't want to eat. It has nice little slices in it, and every slice is a different size. Every slice represents all the root causes that are causing your issues. The pelvic floor is always going to be one of those slices, but for one person, it may be quite small, but for another, it can be quite large. So I'm just going to go ahead and reframe your question to how can we tell that the pelvic floor is a large piece of the pie? First of all, if you're having any other pelvic floor symptoms, that is a huge sign that the pelvic floor is part of the issue. What are pelvic floor symptoms? Perhaps you have pain with intercourse. Perhaps you have tailbone pain. Maybe you have bladder urgency, frequency, incontinence, leaking, nighttime pain. If you have chronic hip pain or aching or groin stiffness, this is another sign that you may have pelvic floor dysfunction. Because a lot of women don't know, because we're not told this, is that some of the pelvic floor muscles also attach onto the hip. And so it can cause some of the symptoms there. And the last thing that may be a sign that you have a larger piece of the pie of the pelvic floor being part of your constipation is if you have pelvic organ prolapse, particularly something called a rectocele. So a rectocele is when a portion of the rectum, which is meant to store the stool until we have a bowel movement, has been stretched out to create an extra little space or a pocket, I might say. And what that does is creates a little hiding place for some of that stool to get caught up in before we have a bowel movement. And that creates more challenge to get it out or evacuate, and that can slow the motility down and cause some constipation. And so if you've been told by your practitioner, your physician, your pelvic floor therapist that you do have a rectocele or a pelvic organ prolapse, or maybe you can feel it, maybe it's heavy pressure like a ball inside of your vagina, and sometimes people will actually see that bulge in their vagina when they're looking with a mirror or looking down. That means that that prolapse could be causing some of the slowdown of your motility.
So good. Oh my gosh. This is something that is so under talked about. And I love your analogy too, Lindsay, of the pieces of the pie, right? For everyone and I'm just going to reiterate this because I think it's really important. So for everyone with sluggish motility and constipation, the pelvic floor plays a role in what's going on. And I love how you shared, it's just a matter of like how big that slice of the pie is. Is it the little sliver or is it like a big giant piece bigger than you would ever eat, even on Thanksgiving? So thanks for sharing that. It's such a good metaphor. So if somebody thinks that, pelvic floor dysfunction might be going on for them or might be a piece of their pie, what's a good first step? How would they figure it out? Where would they start?
So, the folks out there who are the highest trained and will have the most experience for helping you with this is somebody that is a pelvic floor therapist. In many states, provinces, locations, this is going to be physical therapists or physiotherapists. But of course, if you're going to see somebody for a specialized problem, it might be helpful to see somebody who really only specializes in that. Because there are a lot of pelvic floor therapists, physiotherapists, physical therapists who work in clinics that they're also doing another type of physical therapy or physiotherapy. So they might be doing orthopedic or neuro or something else. If you find somebody who works at a pelvic health clinic where that's the only population they're seeing, you may get a higher caliber of skill, experience, knowledge, and just be able to get to the root of your issues faster. In some locations, occupational therapists can also be pelvic health therapists as well, but it'll depend on the state, the location. So that is always a great place to start. But I too have lots of great resources. I have lots of great conversations in my groups. And I also run an online program to help women with bladder leaks, urgency, and frequency. It's not 100% about constipation. However, many of the women that I work with will also come to me there if they have some issues going on there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for answering that, Lindsay. And you being a pelvic floor physiotherapist, a physical therapist yourself, have a ton of experience working with women with motility issues, right? There's a big overlap between motility issues and constipation and some of the bladder leaks, urgency, frequency that you experience as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, when you go to the research, there is a direct correlation with something at like IBS and incontinence.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes people will come to me having gone to their GI doc or their gastroenterologist, and maybe they were told to do something called anorectal manometry or biofeedback. Do you have any experience with that or any thoughts on if that's something that's worth asking your doctor about?
Absolutely. So, another thing that this can be called is rectal balloon training. So, the
Mhm.
manometry, we usually reserve that word for when we're testing it. So if it's a test, we want to see what's happening in the pressure of the rectum and the sensation. But just gathering that information and not doing anything about it is not necessarily that helpful. We want to gather the information, then do something about it. So some pelvic floor therapists will do something called rectal balloon training. And I do this in my clinical practice in my brick and mortar. And what that is that we put a very lubricated, very small catheter that has a balloon into the rectum, and we inflate it with a certain amount of pressure. And so we can mimic a normal size or a standard size of stool. And then lots of wonderful things can happen. We can train that person to either feel it more or feel it less. What do I mean by that? Sometimes with chronic constipation, what happens is that there's stool sitting in that rectum, but the person doesn't know. They don't feel that there's stool there, so they're not going to get the sensation that they have to have a bowel movement. The anal sphincter muscles, they are some of the smartest muscles in the body. And not only do they keep that hole closed towards the rectum, but they also sense what's behind me. Is it gas, liquid, solid? And is it appropriate for me to let this out, or do I need to keep it in? If it doesn't know that the stool is there, it's not going to decide it's time to let it come out. And so some people have a undersensitive rectum and it's not giving us that sensation. So then we have this beautiful opportunity to be able to train the person with the rectal balloon inserted. What else are you feeling in your body? Let's try and wake up that sensation elsewhere. And that way the stool isn't sitting there for too long, where the large intestine is just pulling more and more water out of it, making it more difficult to pass later. For some folks, the sensation is too sensitive. So as soon as we get a little bit of gas, a little bit of liquid, and definitely solid, the sensors are like, wow, there's so much in the rectum right now. We need to let it out. And so it stimulates the bowels to release. And this is often found in people who have a lot of fecal urgency, some maybe fecal incontinence or staining, or that more diarrhea type IBS. And so we can do the opposite. We can start with a very low amount of pressure in that balloon and slowly increase it so that we can practice being able to keep our system calm, keep our muscles doing what we want them to do in order to keep the anus closed and stop that peristalsis or that like urge to get the stool out. And then the last thing that is so helpful, particularly for those folks with constipation, is once that balloon is inflated, we can practice getting it out. So, did you know that there is an optimal way to have your bowel movement beyond putting your feet up on a stool and leaning forward, getting your bum back in the seat, which we all should be doing anyway. But there's a beautiful coordination of the core, of our breathing, of what muscles we use, and all of that can be trained with a pelvic floor therapist so that you can practice basically having a bowel movement of the rectal balloon in the clinic with your therapist in a clean space. Obviously, we're going to set it up so that you're comfortable, and that way you can practice so that when you are on the toilet, then you're able to evacuate it completely, evacuate it in a great amount of time so that you're not sitting there for 20 minutes. It can be really helpful for that as well.
So good, Lindsay. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think what happens in a pelvic floor physical therapy office is a little bit of a mystery for a lot of people. So thanks for kind of peeling back the curtain a little bit and giving us some perspective as to what you might expect if you do go see a pelvic floor physical therapist or physiotherapist. So thanks for that. Well, Lindsay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. This is really such important information that so many of you may see yourselves in what Lindsay shared. If you want to learn more or work with her, I'm going to put her information down below so that you can check her out. As you can tell, she's amazing. Just remember that if constipation is a struggle for you, you are not alone. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. There are always things that you can do to move yourself forward more towards rhythm, more towards regularity, and get the help that you need to do so.